University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex.
U.S. warships and planes launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
After years of devastating cuts, we're now rebuilding our military like we never have before.
Hello and welcome back to Thank You for Your Service, a hard look at American civil military affairs from the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. I'm Thomas Krasnation.
And I'm Nick Pareso.
This is our last episode as the hosts of Thank You for Your Service. We're graduating from the University of Chicago at the end of next week and heading back to the Navy full-time. But we're very excited to share that the podcast will continue.
After this episode, Thank You for Your Service will be leaving the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts organization and will be joining the podcast network at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where it will be co-hosted by civil military relations experts Dr. Alice Hunt-Friend and Dr. Jim Golby. You'll hear from both Alice and Jim in this episode.
If you've only recently found us, you might not know that we came to the University of Chicago directly after graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy in 2018. We came here because we were both interested in studying public policy, and the Naval Academy has a program that allows some graduates to delay their entrance into the fleet, the real Navy, in order to pursue graduate studies at civilian institutions. The hope is that students can enhance their educations and gain valuable insights by doing coursework at a civilian school alongside civilian classmates. In a way, it's kind of like a direct civil-military relations program.
When we came to UChicago, neither of us had any idea what kinds of activities we would do outside the classroom, and we were both surprised to learn that UChicago had a podcast club. Long story short, the club, UC3P, approved our idea for this podcast in October of 2018 and gave us the resources and training we needed to start production. And since then, it's been an amazing journey. We especially wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Corey Shockey and retired Admiral Mike Mullen, our first two guests, who graciously agreed to appear on a brand new show with untested hosts and were extremely patient with our lackluster interviewing skills.
We owe another huge debt of gratitude to David Axelrod, the director of the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, and the host of the Ax-Files podcast and TV show. He also took a chance on us, supporting our podcast and helping secure some of our interview guests before he had any idea if this show would be good, as well as agreeing to be interviewed live in front of an audience here at Harris. The podcast would not have been the same without his encouragement and insight.
This week, for my column Homefront, where we bring you stories about members of the military and their families as we try to bridge the divide between civilians and the military, I introduce you to two recent Naval Academy graduates and their podcast, which is called Thank You for Your Service. This features some really candid interviews from some of the most prominent retired U.S. military officials, as well as experts, scholars, and politicians.
A turning point for Thank You for Your Service, and the time when many of our listeners first heard about us, was March of 2019, when Breonna Keeler, the 1 to 2 p.m. anchor on CNN, decided to do a profile of the podcast for her online column and interview us on her show.
Right now we have Thomas Krasnation and Nick Pareso joining me now. They are behind this podcast. They're coming to us from Chicago, where they are in a master's program at the University of Chicago before they report respectively to a submarine and a destroyer. So I'm talking to both of you for this.
During that process, she also gave us some really valuable coaching on interview techniques that we have used in every episode since then. We're really grateful for her excellent journalism, her unique voice as a military spouse, and all her guidance and support.
On top of all that, it's been an incredible privilege to get to know members of the civil military relations academic community, the professors and practitioners who study and teach about civil military relations for a living. We've been blown away over and over again by the level of encouragement and support they have offered. From answering our random questions over email and Twitter, to sharing our episodes with students, to letting us present alongside them on panels at a conference, they could not have been more kind to us.
And on that note, we want to introduce you, our listeners, to the new co-hosts, Alice Hunt-Friend and Jim Golby. We interviewed Alice a few weeks ago in the podcast studio at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and then spoke with Jim over the phone. First, their bios.
Alice Hunt-Friend is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's a longtime civil military relations and foreign policy analyst, a former Pentagon official, and an adjunct lecturer at American University's School of International Service, where she recently completed her PhD.
Lieutenant Colonel Jim Golby, or as he'll soon be known, just Dr. Jim Golby, is a strategist for the U.S. Army, currently stationed in Europe. Prior to that, he worked in the office of the Vice President, both Joe Biden and Mike Pence, and he taught at West Point. He holds a PhD from Stanford University, and when he retires from the Army this summer, he'll be a senior fellow at the University of Texas at Austin's Clements Center.
We spoke with Alice and Jim to hear about their backgrounds, their assessments of the current state of civil-military relations in America, and where the podcast is headed once they take over. Thanks so much for joining us, Alice.
Hi, guys.
There's a ton of really interesting things we could talk about with your career. First, it would be good for our listeners to hear, how did you first become interested in studying civil military relations?
So I came from a very blue part of the country where there were no military bases, and so I didn't even think about the military careers, military service, national security as a career at all when I was applying for colleges, and I thought I was going to be a theater major. And then my sophomore year of college, I somehow, for some reason, and I don't recall why, became the Smith College delegate to the Naval Academy Foreign Affairs Conference, with which I'm sure you both are quite familiar. And the topic that year was civil military relations, and that was it. I was hooked. I was sort of adopted by an Army captain who showed me the ropes. She was sort of in charge of our little group. And we debated all the big issues of the day in civil relations, which at the time was a lot of social issues, because it was the Clinton administration. And we were talking a lot about both gays in the military as well as humanitarian intervention, the use of force, the purpose of the armed forces, what should the armed forces look like, all this great stuff that I've been fascinated by ever since. And that was it. That really completely relaunched my career thoughts.
Here's what Jim had to say.
For me, my interest and sort of passion for civil military relations started when I was a cadet at West Point. In my junior year, I took a course with a man named Dr. Don Snyder. He was a retired Army officer who had come back and was the Olin Distinguished Professor at West Point. And I had him for two courses. One, which was The Soldier in the State, which was directly about civil military relations. And then the second course I took with him was a course on American defense policy, but it had a lot to do with aspects of civil military relations and the same sort of themes. And just through his example, his mentorship, the opportunity to learn from someone who was as wise and knowledgeable as he is, he's really a giant in the field of military professionalism and civil military relations. I fell in love with the topic. I thought it was, one of the most interesting things I'd done during my time at West Point, had direct applicability to my future career as an officer, and I just have sort of stuck with it ever since.
When you say it had a direct applicability to your future career as an officer, what do you mean by that?
So I think there were two things. One was the immediate impact that it would have as I was a junior officer. So I deployed to Iraq several times. The second time I was there, I was in charge of what they called the Iraqi Business Industrial Zone. It began as a State Department project, but it ended up being a project that relied on interagency cooperation on the ground. And so I had to learn how to work with civilians from other agencies pretty early in my career. Even before that, as a young officer, I was involved in a number of different things where I'd have to interact with people from either my home community or with friends, just trying to explain to them what I was doing, why it was important, and in all sorts of little ways, bridging that gap between my friends and family and anybody else I came into contact with.
So after undergrad, I actually went and did AmeriCorps for a year. And I worked with Big Brothers Big Sisters of Colorado that was based in Denver. I think they're still based in Denver out there. And I did that year of national service. And part of doing AmeriCorps is you take the oath of office at the beginning of it, and they really emphasize the idea of voluntarism and national service all year long. And I just loved it. I had a fabulous time.
If you could point to one formative moment in your career so far, what would it be?
So there are two. One is AmeriCorps. I think that got me, that combined with my academic and nerdy interest in the civil relations questions, really got me on a path to service. I decided after that I wanted to serve in the government. And I just spent the next several years trying to figure out how to get back into government service. But the other one has to be my service at the Pentagon. You know, that was a life changer, an incredible teacher. I acquired so many dear friends and mentors there. You can't learn in the classroom the way you can learn sitting in the Pentagon and going over to the White House for meetings and really living through the decision-making and policy-making process. So I just had a fantastic time doing that. And of all my experiences at the Pentagon, I was there for 5.5 years. I'm the proudest of my work with the Africa office as their principal director. We had a great team. It's a very small office covering a very big continent. 10 action officers, 54 countries, and my team was just awesome, and I was so privileged to work with them.
It was one of those things that you never are really prepared to do it until you've had some experience doing it. But I was so fortunate to have months really with Don Snyder and other cadets to think through these issues, to think about the challenges we would face. At the time when I was a cadet, we were mostly concerned about peacekeeping operations in Bosnia and Kosovo, but a lot of the same types of themes and lessons that came up in that course with respect to how you interact with civilians, how you develop legitimacy, were lessons that I took directly to my experiences in Iraq.
So you've studied civil relations academically, but you also got a chance to really see how it interacts at the ground level working at the Pentagon. I'm curious how those two lined up or didn't line up, both the academic side and the practical on the ground side.
Yeah, what really fascinated me was when I was doing my master's degree, I did a thesis that really looked at this very nerdy academic debate about framing discussions and framing and language and how military expertise can come to define what values we're going to prioritize in a conversation or in a policy decision, and thinking about the degree to which both sort of consciously and subliminally civilians and everyone in the national security space think through problems the way the military defines or conceives of them, right? But that was all very abstract in a lot of ways, and I was looking retrospectively at the humanitarian intervention decisions of the 1990s. So why did we intervene in Somalia? Why didn't we intervene in Rwanda? And what did the civil-military dialogue have to do with that? So then I show up at the Pentagon, and I actually live the civil-military dialogue. And the thing is that especially before you've worked in the building, and as a very young scholar just getting good at empirical research, although I don't know if I was so good at it, you sort of think of the military in their corner and civilians in their corner and coming together at meetings, right? And then sort of talking past each other. That's sort of the idealized, totally unrealistic vision one can get in one's head. Working the Pentagon, civilians and the military work side by side next to each other in cubicles on the same issues. And even when there's a clearly civilian institution like OSD and a clearly military institution like the Joint Staff, there are civilians working for the Joint Staff. There are military officers working for OSD. And for a while, I worked on the Pakistan account, and we were incredibly close and collaborative with the Joint Staff office that worked on Pakistan. And so the degree to which the relationship wasn't adversarial, we had radically different perspectives on issues, was really collaborative, and we had things to teach each other, but we taught each other. A lot of my early education in the Pentagon came from folks in uniform. Literally one day, a captain that we worked with on the Pakistan desk, we got a report from Afghanistan, and it was like shot by shot laydown of a battle, and I didn't understand any of it. And he sat down with me and taught me how to read all the jargon, stuff like that.